Hello, everyone. This is your host, Jawad from Kingdom of Dreams podcast. Welcome to another episode. Today, my guest is none other than the great John Seale, who I've spoken to many, many times. He's worked on films like English Patient, Harry Potter, and today I am going to be talking to him about the classic Lorenzo's Oil, starring Nick Nolte and Susan Sarandon. We touched upon a lot of different points, including George Miller's directing style, that it was his first film that he worked with George Miller at the time, lighting techniques, and just the overall story and performances and the medical aspect of the story. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you so much. How have you been?
Pretty good, pretty good, pretty busy. I went to North Macedonia for the Monarchy Brothers Festival, which was lovely. Went up to a little town up north of Sydney, about 4 hours, 4.5 hour drive. Uh, they had a they had a sort of a lovely 50-year ceremony of a TV series we did in a little country town 50 years ago, and they haven't forgotten it. So they got whoever's still alive, and we all went up there and walked along the beach where we shot it. So I did that
Mm.
a couple of 2 weeks ago, and now I've been asked to go to India uh, for a liaison conference between Australia and India on co-production of feature films. So it's all go in retirement.
That's amazing. That's really good. Where are you going in India? In Mumbai?
Goa.
Goa.
They're
That's a
having
that's a touristy
Yeah,
spot.
they're having the big conference there. So it's quite big. I think it's the Indian Film Festival as well combined. They're putting all of the film kind of business into one 8 day festival. Includes the bazaar, the film bazaar, the film festival, and this great big meeting between Australia and India. I think Phil Noyce is going, the director, and myself. I'm not too sure who else is going to represent Australia, and obviously to give master classes and things to students. So that's good.
That's really cool. I was at TIFF this year, and they had in the press and industry section, they had all the different countries' booths, and Australia, New Zealand, India specifically was a pretty big one, and their co-productions were like they were offering a lot of money. I think if I'm not mistaken, the banner that I read with Canadian co-productions, like you could get up to like 45 million dollars, and for a whole production, which so they're it's good. It's a big market. I mean, Indian cinema is a big market, just A, the population, and B, the reach they have.
Yeah.
So it and the cinema in India is changing. I grew up with it. There was, what was called art cinema, but now there is the mainstream, which is kind of like Hollywood, like completely mainstream. And then there's real stories, which are really becoming very well known among audience. And that's what I watch if I watch something from India. Um, I,
Right.
s- I saw this film, which I highly recommend when it comes out in January. It's based on a true story. It's called Super Boys of Maligaon. It's about a small village, and this one group of friends, they turn into filmmakers. And there's a lot of twists and turns in the story. It's based on a documentary and a true story. When it comes, I think it comes in January. Highly recommend you check it out. It's a great film.
I'll keep an eye out for that. They may even have it at the festival, do you think?
Possibly, maybe.
At the end, it's at the end of the month. So
What's the festival called? Goa?
it's the IFFI, the International Film Festival of India, and it's at Goa at the Marriott Resort,
Yeah, no,
Goa.
I
I
don't
think it's
I don't see that, but I'll send you the name and you can, yeah, you can look it up. But I don't think it's playing there from what I'm just looking at in the quick Google search. But that's good. That's good stuff.
yeah, it keeps me busy, and with everything else I've got to do here in Sydney. Um, it's all go go go. I keep telling people if I want to slow down, I'll go back to work.
That's a good one. Yes, yes. But it's good to be busy, you know, your brain needs to be
Very
constantly functional and uh up, go, 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 because the moment you sit idle at any age, it's just that's when the crazy stuff
exactly,
starts happening.
exactly right. Yeah, so it's good. It's really good, and I had a lot of trouble working out what I would lecture on because I think we've discussed this before that chemical filmmaking, as in film and negatives and positives, is gone. So there's not much point really in talking about that. Some people are
Mm.
interested, but the digital revolution, I think, has taken over. And unfortunately, or fortunately, that's changing every day, every week. There's new lighting gear, camera gear, post production, computerization of images is changing every week. So I haven't kept up with that, and I didn't know quite what I was going to talk about. But I found a little niche where I do like to talk about the attitude of the camera person with the camera in their hand to the written script, to the film that the director's trying to interpret. So I find that quite interesting and can become quite deep about that.
I I couldn't agree with you more because, you know, with all the technology that's been coming out, like obviously my experience is last 25 years. Yours is much, much longer than that, twice as much, possibly even more. But from my point of view, like the evolution of, from film to camcorder. Then there was a Canon Panasonic DVX100 that came out, then Panasonic HVX and Canon XH and Canon 5, the DSLR 5D market, and then the Red and all that stuff. But I remember I got myself caught in that technological aspect. And after 7, 8 years, I realized very thoroughly that nobody gives a crap about your equipment. It's just the story, which is what you're talking about. That will never get old. The art
Yeah,
of storytelling, whether it's through editing, whether it's through directing, costume, cinematography, whatever, that just remains constant. And that's what people want to hear about, anyways, because they can find technology online or buy it in their hands and play around with it.
very, very valid points there. I agree with them totally. And I think it's good though that the professional people do maintain that a high standard and use different cameras, different lenses, different filtration, whatever they want to do to make the image for their film the image that the film should be
Yeah,
represented in. But I do agree then that the audience go in and they just haven't got a clue about that. If you
yeah.
haven't grabbed them by the first three shots of the movie, then it should be rewritten. But I'm fairly fierce about a lot of that. I think having very luckily have worked with some very, very good directors and good screenplays that I do feel honestly that that's where the power is. Yeah.
Yeah. And that brings me to our conversation about the film Lorenzo's Oil, which I had not, I had seen it long time ago, and I have completely forgotten the turns and the ups and downs and the story. And at the time that I saw it, it came out, I think, in mid 90s, 92, 93, I think. And I think I saw it in 1995. It held a very different meaning for me because I was young. But watching it now, being obviously, a little bit more wiser, but also one of my cousins, my first cousin in the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, they say that she got multiple sclerosis, who I had just met like maybe for a couple of weeks in my entire life. And that really came back. and I haven't met her in
Oh, it
like
would.
20 years because it was the same. It was not the same disease, but it was just the same kind of thing where you couldn't talk, where you couldn't see, where your hands were like this. And what a powerful film, and performances and cinematography was just top notch as usual.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it was a very powerful film. I remember I couldn't get to any. I was shooting somewhere in America, um, and the film was released, and it came into a local theatre. And the camera crew that I was working with, I said, "Do you want to come and have a look at it?" And we went along, and one of the guys got up and walked out. Um, And I thought, oh, gee, I wonder what's happened there. And afterwards, we met outside. And I said, "Are you okay? Everything all right?" He said, "No." He said, "I couldn't handle that." He said, "My brother or sister or a cousin or something had a very similar problem." And he said it was too close to the bone for me. I had to get out. But I think that's where George Miller, our director, is such an interesting man that it's a very, very interesting story, I think, of how he came to do that film. And I believe I'm right in that he was on a plane from Sydney to London, which, as you know, is about a 23-hour trip. And he read the book, I think, or he read an article in a magazine. It might have even been, I could stand corrected here. I think it might have been the In-Flight magazine was a story on the Adonis and the boy and the problem. And by the time he landed in London, having been a doctor himself,
Hmm.
uh, he landed in London and he rang his screenplay writer and said, "Get over here. We're going to write this. This is a movie." And away he went. And that was the instigation. He went straight away. He was going to London for some other film, I think, development. Um, Cancelled all that, I believe, and raced across to America to meet the Adonis and say, I knocked on their front door, introduced himself and said, "I want to make a movie about," and they wouldn't have it. They didn't want to do it. Um, and he had to talk them into it, which was the fierceness of George. He doesn't give up easily. Um, and he ended up getting permission to make it. I remember one of the conditions, though, was that the character who played uh, Michael O'Doney, I think it was, um, had to have the accent. And George agreed straight away because we made films in Australia and you made them honestly. But I believe there was a little bit of hesitation by the studios. They sort of, what? They didn't want this accent, but I love Nick Nolte. I know he's had a very, very exciting life, um, but I loved him on the part. He grabbed hold of the accent and the character, and he ran with it. It was a delight to work with him. It really was.
Yeah, when he first started talking in the film, it was, I won't lie, it was like, okay, how am I gonna stay with this character,
Yes.
right? But it was just over time as the story moved on, you couldn't help figure but not think that this is the way this guy talks all the time, Nick Nolte as an actor too, because he was just so believable, it was so convincing. And it was just
Yeah.
such a great balance between his character and his performance with, versus Susan Sarandon. Um, and for me, from a cinematography standpoint, I took some notes. There are some shots that really, I mean, there's so many, but there was a couple that really stood out for me, especially that one where the camera just dollies in on Susan Sarandon's face and it goes past her, and there's the window, and the kids are playing outside, and Lorenzo's on the bike goes out of the frame and along with their kids, and there's another girl, she sees something and she runs and she almost walks out of the frame and then she comes back in.
Yeah.
That was such a great shot. Like in just, one, no cut, nothing. You just did everything without saying anything, without cutting. Um, and another shot was, I'm just gonna name two more shots and I'll let you talk. Was when he falls off on the chair with the Christmas tree, just the way the camera movement was, and there were obviously cuts, because you wanted to make sure that the cuts were done in a way where you don't see him actually falling on the ground, but it was just so believable. um the one that really stood out for me, I don't even know why, but it just did from an emotional standpoint and creative standpoint. I think it was Lorenzo with his teacher. Is it Laura Finney, is her name?
I
um
think, yeah.
they're standing on the steps, on the staircase, on the top of the staircase, and the camera's right behind her. And at a far distant is Nick Nolte, Susan Sarandon, and I think one of the other teachers is having a meeting. I thought that was the best shot in the entire film. I don't know why, but it just did so much for me emotionally and creatively.
It's where it was the first film that I photographed for George, and I was very excited about that, of course, and even more excited by the end of it because George showed me not to be scared, not to be uh, so enamored with the formulaic way to shoot movies, um, to break out of that and shoot the movie that is written. Um, and the camera finds the dramas in a way without necessarily being overly obvious,
Mm-hmm.
uh, by using camera. He was using Dutching angles that, we used to Dutch be prior to that
Yeah.
film. We Dutch a little bit. George cranked it over nearly 45 degrees on two shot compositions where Nick Nolte was obviously taller than Susan, so the anamorphic frame couldn't fit those in comfortably, so he tilted the camera over to make it fit comfortably. But in the way it was edited as well, it all works so brilliantly, and I learnt so much out of that from George, um, that it held me in good stead for the rest of my career of not being afraid to be, very bold with the camera as long as it suits the story. And this is what I try to say to students, be bold and brave, but suit the story. Don't just be a photographer. You're
Yeah.
actually making a film or helping to make a film. Um, and I also use the example of when the medical man is literally saying to the Adonis, Nick and Susan, playing it, that their son, with the problem he has, will unequivocally die. And I just found that Susan Sarandon is a wonderful, wonderful woman. She is a mother. She loves being a mother. She loves children. She loves family. She is perfect. And to tell that woman that her son would die to me was the greatest bit of acting, and the simplicity of the camera. Started as a two shot with the two of them, and it just started slowly moving in while the doctor outlined the problem or whatever. And then it lost uh, Nick Nolte and went in and in on the mother. And that piece of performance, or to be quite honest, it'll stay with me for the rest of my life, because there was a woman acting. Sure, she's acting, but she's the most wonderful mother in real life. And it just, she she fell apart from inside, and then it slowly came out. And the simplicity of the camera just letting that happen is another lesson learnt for me of keeping the camera simple and let the actors portray the emotion of the script, the story of the situation that they're in, the emotion of it. Let them do it. The camera doesn't have to do it if you're looking at somebody with the qualities of Susan Sarandon. You got to love it. And you got to love Susan Sarandon. Who doesn't love Susan Sarandon? I want to know.
You know, up until I saw this movie again, my favorite film of her, and I think one of the best performances ever by her in general, was Dead Man Walking with Sean
Uh,
Penn, which was directed by her ex-husband Tim Robbins. But this, I mean, they both came around like I think 5, 6 years apart. This was like right up there too, like just her anger and her tears and her denial and her not giving up. And one thing that you talked about that George was trying to tell, was telling you, and obviously in editing as well, is to be bold. And one thing that I noticed in editing, which I'm going to be very frank, and the very first time, a couple of times it happened, it took me out of the film, but then it brought me back in. There was a lot of 5 months later, 6 months later, 1 week later, 4 years later. And there was a lot of fade ins and fade out, which is not conventional for a film. I know it was like it took place over time, but just was happening so many times, even though it was a little bit distracting in the beginning, it really worked in the end by the film ended because it was, documenting certain stages of this boy's life and the disease and the family struggle.
well, one of the really powerful visual things that George created for the film, which very sadly didn't happen, and I'm very sad about that. And while we were shooting later on Fury Road, I think it was, we were discussing that, and I'll get to that later. But the moment the boy is diagnosed with this disease and he's on the downhill slide, uh, George wanted to take out all the color. So as he's heading towards death, the color would come out. I think it was over about nearly an hour of screen time, and he wanted to sift it out very slowly so that by the time the boy emotionally in the film hits rock bottom, you're now in full black and white. And he didn't want the audience to realize that that's what had happened, that the emotion of that downhill slide from the actors, the editing, everything combined with the desaturation of the color out of the film uh, would take the audience into a very low place because the boy had got there. And then the moment they found an oil that altered it and actually helped him come back to a modicum of health, George was going to slam the colour back in. And I think that was over, if I remember, 17 minutes. It was 17 or 19 minutes, something like that, that the colour would come streaming back in as the revelation that this oil would stop the child's downhill slide and possibly bring him back to a reasonable normality. And I thought that was one of the most wonderful, uh, wonderful and powerful pieces of cinematography that I could imagine in a film that is so simple. Not a big action film where you can hide in amongst other forms of action or direction, that it can only hide behind the emotion of the people, and that is the performance of those actors. I thought that was one of the boldest pieces of uh, cinematography that I had been asked to be part of or to help present. And I loved it. I loved it. Very sadly, back then, long before the computer age, um, it was a nightmare. I went off, George isn't fast in post, we know that. And it took a long time. So I went off and did another movie. And in the middle of that, George started timing the film for the release print and starting this desaturation, degrading it. but it was almost impossible. George kept ringing, and he'd say 2 months or something, and I'm barely finishing reel one. I don't think this is going to work. Because it was a very complex technical process in a laboratory, um, and it didn't work. And
Did
I had made the mistake of shooting some parts of the film in black and white in my mind. In other words, I was crossing over the color between daylight and tungsten
mm,
because I didn't have to worry. I kept saying to George, "This is definitely going to be black and white, George." And he'd say, "Yep, Johnny, it will be black and white." So I just didn't worry about gelling lamps to match whatever I was shooting. So there was a big range of color shifts there that shouldn't be there. But it didn't harm the emotion of the film, I've got to say. Um, and in hindsight, as I said, I said to George, maybe you could do a director's regrade in hindsight and do it on a computer in 10 minutes. But I don't think it's happened yet. I don't know whether it will or not, but
yeah.
it
I'm
was a
glad you brought that up.
brilliant piece, brilliant concept.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because I read about it, and what I had read is a completely different version from what you told me, which is accurate, is that you guys were planning to shoot the film as a halfway through in black and white on film in black and white, but because of the cost of black and white film, it just wasn't in the budget. So obviously that's not the story that I read, but what you just said, it makes more sense because that would have been really cool. It's not that there's just going from color to black and white and that's it. It's like like a little wavelength, like color to black and white, and then coming back into color based on the emotion and the arc of the story.
Yeah, because
That's
most of the story up until the boy is diagnosed is in color, and I think that was essentially that we kept it simple and shot that in color because he did want this very gradual slide from a full color uh, reality situation of life,
yeah.
contemporary, and then take it to black and white because of the medical reasons. I'd love to see him do it. I really would. I think it would dot the I on the emotion. It'd be interesting to see the psychological um, result of it with people that would they get to seeing a black and white image and not realize it because the rest of the film is a very powerful emotional downhill slide for any parent to go through. And I
Yeah.
think that's what George was aiming for, was to fully enhance that with a little bit of cinema um, uh, reality of being able to take colour out and take it down to a rock bottom level of emotion. I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was a brilliant concept.
I think if he decides to do it, it is going to work because one of the things that you said that there are certain color tones in there that are not consistent. Honestly, I did not pick up on anything because maybe because I was so emotionally heavily invested into the film and the characters and the story that it just did not. It was not like it was like a reality for me, right? So I think that idea of slowly shifting into black and white would be really cool to see. It would be really cool to see. Um, you know, George Miller being a doctor himself is something that I noticed in this film. I don't want to call the doctors in the film as antagonists because, they are trying to present science and these things take time, a lot of tests. But for the sake of argument, one of the things that I really found very, very effective, and every time I guessed that now there's going to be a shift, I was dead wrong because throughout the film you hear the doctors' sides. Like, I forget the names of the doctors, but there was like four or five of them. And you constantly hear that. Now I wonder if George was not a doctor, um, if that and if it was not based on a true story, that shift of the doctors in, kind of giving into the mother's emotions would have happened, because in this one it did not. It just kept persistent. And that really, as much as I couldn't stand the characters of the doctors, that really worked in her quest and trying to go through the struggle up over and over again.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what jogged George on the flight to London, was being a doctor and understanding, uh, the dramas of the medical world, trying to stop this downhill slide of the child. Um, and I would imagine that as a doctor, he would, and he obviously did, find that a very exciting challenge. Um, Maybe, and I think it was fairly obvious, was that the doctors didn't back then didn't really know how to cure it, and it was the Adonis perse perseverance with the looking for the answer. Somewhere there must be an answer in food or vitamins or cell structure, that thing. And I think that George's medical history obviously instigated the film, but then pushed it, I think, a lot towards the Adonis perseverance, purely as the film subject matter, to be able to say, that maybe for all of us, doctors are great, but a lot of it's up to us to not necessarily read between the lines. We can't do that, but to question, maybe question in our own minds, that is there not an answer to this? Is there something, a link somewhere that could be found? And maybe that's what, I'm not sure, I'm guessing now, but maybe that's what George looked for, that from a medical world, he had to shift it over to a parent's world of the sheer desire for survival of their child pushed them into a medical world, and they found the thin end of the wedge, which is what the film really portrays. It it's a very complex one. I love the way George did it. I'm not. I wouldn't like to guess how anybody else would do it. Maybe they if they didn't have a medical background that could balance these
Yeah,
thoughts out. That's the difficulty, I think.
yeah.
I
And
know
what?
that George. I remember we were shooting in Australia, endless close-ups of words, and the research by
Yeah,
the Adonis, endlessly shooting that, the finding of a one word that would then you know, push the film on to another emotional moment between the parents and the child and the doctors. And then they go back to the library and find another word. Was quite a wonderful way of showing it, how the Adonis did it.
yeah. That actually, that was something that again, it was just such an unpredictable scene, because normally when you see text overlaying and again, you figure it's gonna end after like 5, 7, maybe 10 seconds, but it just kept going, and it worked
Yeah,
because you were inside the character's head. And one of the things you mentioned earlier, John, was, we doctors are great, but we have to do something ourselves. And I couldn't agree with you more. It's like I find that people are way too reliant on medication, as opposed to looking after their health, what they eat, exercise. I'll give you an example. You know, this was like before COVID. I went to see a doctor because I had a fever. I normally wait it out unless it gets really, really bad. And I go in and I'm like, I don't want any antibiotics or anything. I just need to figure this out somehow. And the doctor looked at me and she's like, you're probably one of the first patients who has told me that they don't want antibiotics. People come in here with little bit of, nasal cold or flu, and they want medication, and we just can't give it to them. So I think people have become so reliant on this whole medication thing that even the littlest of pain, okay, let's go get medication. And well, there's
Yeah,
natural solutions available.
yeah, yeah. It's it's a pretty devastating. I will say, in all honesty, that between the two countries, Australia and America, um, I found big differences in the use of antibiotics. Um, we don't use them as much in Australia, anywhere near as much. And I found I had an experience where I had a very minor operation um,
Mm.
in Australia, and uh, I went off to Canada to a little cruise ship, a little one. I think it had about 50 people or something. But I got a urinary tract infection on board the boat, and they got very worried. But the boat happened to be full of American doctors. So the captain of the boat was a lovely little lady, and she said, I think you need antibiotics. I said, well, I don't have any. She said, oh, you don't? And I said, well, no, I don't carry antibiotics. And so she said, well, we'll put out a notice on the ship's loudspeakers. Well, within 10 minutes, there was a bucket full of antibiotics. And the one doctor who came offered to come and have a look at me and tested my urine and stuff like that. And I held, I held it up and I said, look at that. It's as clear as white wine. He said, rubbish, you've got an infection. We need the antibiotics. So they called them up and we got a bucket full of them. And he took his pick. He said, take that one, try that one. And it dawned on us that everybody on board had antibiotics and carried them as a normality when they're traveling, which we never do. And he said to me, he said, didn't they give you antibiotics prior to this medical procedure? And I said, no, never do. He said, amazing, amazing. And I think it's that you take it if you get the problem, you don't take it
Yeah,
to combat the possibility of the problem. And then you
yeah,
build up a resistance to it. And, oh, well, it goes on and on. But I think
yeah,
uh, I think that's literally the film. Yeah, it's about the film pursuing the ends when you don't think there's any answer. Maybe there is.
yeah. And it's, you know, um, this whole part about persistence and trying to find answers. It's amazing that how these parents who have never been to medical school, who have never probably picked up the biology book or have, or they failed the course, and they were able to grasp so much knowledge because the situation put them there, and they started talking like doctors, which I
Yeah,
thought was pretty amazing. That how
yeah,
as human beings, we have so much ability. If we really push for it, anything is possible.
yeah. Yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah, never give up. Yeah.
Yeah. What was was there a moment on the set, a scene? I mean, there's a lot of scenes where the boy or different kids, I think, who played Lorenzo at a different age, they have these sound, they scream and they cry, and it's not even a cry, it's like they can't talk, so they're just like letting out their sound. Was there any moment, something like that, or anything else on the set where it just got you or the crew really, really deeply?
Oh, there was. I mean, it's not the nicest subject matter to have to go to work every day with this high emotion on set between the adult actors and the different children we used. Uh, it drains you. There's no question about that, and you have to. I found sit behind the camera waiting for moments, and quite often those moments happened uh, uh, on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And so your finger was always on the button, and it wasn't kind of like a standard standby, we'll roll on this, because that could lose the moment. Um, as the operator as well on the film, I found that I just sat there listening to George, listening to where the actors were at a certain emotional moment and what we were looking for, what the script and that moment was looking for. And if it started to look like it had happened, you'd roll film, just quietly hit the buttons. And the whole crew were geared to that. The boom operators had their microphones in there nearly all the time, ready for sound capture. Um, and we were well, I was sitting there with my finger on the button the whole time. And if it looked like that, bam, you'd roll the camera real quick. And if it looked like you'd got it, you could quietly pan off and quickly do a little end slate, get the camera back on the subjects and hit finger back on the button and wait again. There was a lot of that.
Yeah.
Um, and it was, in all honesty, I think what I'm hearing you say and the way we shot it, it was like really a documentary, a very dramatized documentary. And we had to handle that way. I mean, it wasn't good having to ask a child to perform that and then maintain it. Um, and the sets had to be very quiet and no noise, no sort of yelling or anything, or noise of shooting film. This is shooting film. It was just as though the camera wasn't there. Very quiet. Everything was quiet. Um, so the day was long because of that. It's the difference between that movie and many others where the noise and the energy is all part of a filmmaking process. That one wasn't. It was set up. Well, I knew what George wanted. I thought like visually, but then the emotion was something that we had to grab and capture when we could, um, and very demanding, very demanding. That kind of film I found compared to others.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it certainly there was a lot of elements in there where it did feel like a docu style, but at the same time, it felt like a narrative. From a lighting perspective, there were some compared to your other work that we've talked about, Harry Potter, English Patient, um, from a lighting standpoint, because of the way the story was, there weren't anything, you know, super stylistic because of the nature of the story, but at the same time, you had to light it up and everything. Was there a particular scene or scenes that were difficult, not to light up, but just to make sure it reflects the tone of the story and what's happening in front of the camera?
Well, that's where it was quite interesting visually because the concept of shooting natural reality lighting situation up to a certain point
Yeah.
um, was quite relatively easy. I feel and hope that I approached films in the nature and the situation that they were set in with a reality of lighting for that. And this was quite easy in a way because it was a contemporary movie
Mm,
and it was reality up to that point where the boy is, where they're told that he's going to die. And then from then on, the concept was this desaturation, which uh, we didn't do anything to the lighting. And I remember that a lot of the crew, wardrobe, makeup, hair, wardrobe, were very worried about what the desaturation meant. They said, well, we got to desaturate our wardrobe. And it was, no, no, no. no, that'll be done chemically in the lab. We'll just we take the color out overall out of the thing. So that took a little settling down of crew, um, and we lived by that. We shot by that, and luckily it didn't, or wasn't. I didn't do anything in the camera onto film because it was going to be done in the lab.
Mm,
And so luckily when it couldn't be done in the lab, the film was able to run in reality color all the way through. But as I said, it did upset a few of the departments. Uh, Even at rock bottom, we did a lot of testing in post. We even started to shoot on transfer stock, which was a slash print stock, which was a highly contrasty black and white. It was it was a cheap slash print film that they had, and we started shooting on that. And George loved it, but it was black and white. It wasn't There wasn't a grey to be seen in it, and it was stark, and it was brilliant for that. George is very excited about it. But we tested on that, and that was
mm,
looking really good for the really rock bottom. Um, but then, of course, that didn't happen. But the actual shoot, no considerations weren't really taken in to desaturate the original negative. Luckily, so we just rocked through
right.
pretty normally. We did enhance dramatically some of the lighting to suit the dramas that the Adonis were going through,
Hmm.
particularly Michael Adoni with in the library. We shut lights down and just gave him a light to work on to say, hey, he worked all night and the library shut down. Reality might say the library would never shut down their lights.
Yeah.
They would leave them burning. But that in the drama of the film,
Yeah.
it was nice to be able to create a little visual drama as we went along to suit his moods and his uh, length of stay in the library was well into the night, into the dawn, trying to find answers. So we did
Sure.
a little bit of that. George was great because he doesn't and didn't like formality of lighting. There was a situation where uh, Nick always wore his little glasses, and they gave me hell with light reflections and things. But there's a shot where he's standing over the top of a practical light, and he's looking down at Susan, and he's got his little bifocals on, and this light is reflected completely in the glasses, and we lose his eyes. And I said to George, I'll try and get rid of that. Not too sure. Oh, I didn't know how to do it. It was so funny because the light was in shot, but
Right.
I was thinking that I might put a piece of neutral density N9 or something
Yeah.
hidden in the top of the light.
Diffuse it.
Yep. And try and reduce it and not, and George said, Johnny, I love it. And I said, thank God, George, you've got it. So he was like that. I learned from him on that film that reality of lighting or little dramatic moments of lighting that occur that are reality, he'll live with them,
Yeah.
which was most interesting, most interesting.
Nice. Just one last part, John. Was the film shot in a traditional way based on the schedule that you guys had, or was it in any way shot chronologically in
Oh,
terms of the story unfolding? Do you remember?
oh, no, no, I don't. But there is something to do with the way we shot it chronologically. And gee, I forget what it is. It might have been something to do about the boy, um, or availability. There was something there, but
Okay, okay.
I'm an old
That's
man
fine.
now.
That's fine. That's all good. That's all good. Well, This has been amazing, and like always, pleasure talking to you, John, and learning from you about the amazing films that you worked on and keeping yourself busy with all the wonderful stuff that you got ahead of you.
Thank you very much for that. And yes, I'm looking forward to it. The future in maybe helping in some little way or form. It'll be fun.
Great. Well, if I don't talk to you until then, maybe in the new year, happy holidays and enjoy your trip to India and everything else.
You too, Joe. Thank you very much.
Take care, John.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye.